Welcome to Lighting Bricolage, doing more with less. I'm Raqi Syed. I've spent many years working in traditional offline rendering environments. First at studio like Disney Feature Animation, and then many years at Weta Digital. So what I know how to do is light for feature film, and particularly to light characters, and understand how those characters can help us tell their vehicles for storytelling. In the last few years, I've been focusing on making narrative virtual reality and developing my own projects for the Unreal Engine. I also teach and do research at Victoria University of Wellington. Today, I want to talk to you about a framework for designing and building worlds from a lighter's perspective. So these lights are very responsive for tools for telling stories. They work as a tool because this world, everything in it, you, me, this beautiful room, it has all been created for us. These hero assets have already been built. And when we light, we get all of that for free. I enjoy looking at and experiencing the world as a lighter. It's fun to think about how light shapes storytelling. But all the other parts of image making are often a mystery to me. Being a specialist can be a kind of Achilles heel in this way. As lighters, this is our challenge. How can we quickly build worlds in order to spend most of the time doing what we love, which is lighting those worlds? So, what is bricolage? It's French for making do. The concept of bricolage was coined by the French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss. He saw the bricoleur as someone who is resourceful and creative, a person who creates new objects out of existing ones. Claude Lévi-Strauss once wrote, "In our own time, the bricoleur is still someone who works with their hands and uses devious methods compared to those of a craftsman." I really like to think of the technical artist as someone who is absolutely willing to use devious methods, any methods, in fact, to get the job done. Our goal is a little different, though. Our goal is always in the service of making beautiful images and telling stories through those images. I first learned about bricolage in film school. The cinema structuralists were really into bricolage. For them, bricolage was a process by which people acquired objects from across social divisions to create new cultural identities. Punk fashion is one example. Punk music, musicians and artists used to repurpose suits for streetwear, for example. They would use safety pins as a kind of sculptural embellishment, and they rejected all rules about formal and casual wear. So they were picking and choosing different objects from across social identities to construct a new one. Filmmakers like Jean-Luc Godard were also bricolage artists in their own time. So Breathless, this is a still from the 1960 film Breathless, combined seemingly ad hoc elements of the time, like a girl, a gun, a real location, and an editing style now famously known as the jump cut. But these improvisations arose out of the necessity of having to make do. So the famous story goes that Jean-Luc Godard finished editing Breathless one afternoon, took it to his distributor, and was told that there's no way they can show this film because it's 3,000 meters too long. So he went back home and furiously cut out 3,000 meters by randomly just picking tons and tons of frames, came back to the distributor a few hours later and handed over the film, and we now had the jump cut for the first time. What's especially interesting about the French New Wave is that they came to the filmmaking process not as directors, but as fans, writers, and theorists. They wanted to use their experience of growing up on the streets of Paris in the 1960s youth culture, and also their love of genre to tell a new kind of story. They were always interested in drawing upon their own experience in the world, this lived experience, this feeling of being in Paris in the 1960s, to tell a story. The next generation of filmmakers, known as the American New Wave, grew up watching these films. And filmmakers like George Lucas and Steven Spielberg created their own improvisations by applying bricolage to genre. Here, George Lucas uses his experience of growing up watching 1930s Hollywood serials, James Bond films, and his interest in comedy to invent a new genre. The action-adventure comedy spectacle known as Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom was born. And we've never been without it since. Another example of bricolage genre, James Cameron's Avatar, in which we have romance, melodrama, the Western, climate change, and science fiction. I remember thinking when I was first working on this show that this film has so many elements. How can they possibly come together? And I think it's the unexpected collision of these elements that makes it work. It's this unique vision of bricolage. We could argue that in cinema, bricolage is really just an exploration of pastiche. But the approach is widely used across the arts. One of my favorite explorations of how bricolage operates is from a 2005 interview with the Turkish writer Orhan Pamuk. In the Paris Review, he wrote, "The formula for originality is very simple. Put together two things that were not together before. In this case, the history of the Ottoman Empire and a classic murder mystery." He makes it sound so easy that you might win a Nobel Prize as a side effect of practicing bricolage. And Marcel Duchamp's urinal, repurposed as the fountain, may be the most famous and well-respected now example of making do in the art world. The idea of bricolage goes even further back. Cabinets of curiosities were the very first kinds of museums. In the Renaissance and Baroque periods, when travel was difficult and expensive, rare, people did travel. They collected small items or small curiosities that they could easily take back home. And when they got back home, they built cabinets to display these objects. And we can think about the contents and the way in which they were exhibited. They were often placed in concealed and nested drawers and shelves as a way to create meaning, as Orhan Pamuk suggests, by placing two seemingly unrelated objects together, something new emerges. In my own practice, I rely on this bricolage approach. I'm a visual effects artist, I also write, and I also do a bunch of other stuff. I teach, I make virtual reality, I study media archaeology, sometimes I write essays, and I'm constantly learning new software in order to expand my skills. For me, a useful thing to think about is, what is my core competency? The thing that I've spent many years doing is going deep into the world of lighting in order to develop a level of expertise as a feature film lighter specifically in visual effects. And there are a lot of other things that I want to learn about, but I'm not an expert in. And I think this is the challenge for a lot of technical artists, is that you're either coming from a specialty or you're having to work in a context where you're doing a specific job, and then you might have to turn your attention to something else. And how do we very quickly level up in order to do those jobs? So I often have to make do to compensate for all the areas that I'm not an expert in, particularly when I put my director hat on and I make my own independent work. In my next project, which focuses on a single character who appears in a theater-like experience, it's an animated docu-memoir genre. And so I asked myself, if bricolage can be applied to scene construction and other ways of making films, world building, genre, what happens if we apply it to character creation? So I'm going to walk you through now a process that I've been working through to quickly build characters that I can then light and put in environments and start to then build some story for this project that I'm working on. So this is all kind of work in project, prototype stuff. But what you see here is on my right, there's an image, that's a photographic image of me. In the middle is a automatically generated mesh of my face using the Real Illusion software, specifically the headshot plugin that they have. And this is pretty good. Like, it looks like me. But most of the detail that we're seeing is coming from the texture, particularly the albedo map. And when we strip this texture away, what we see is a pretty generic mesh underneath. So what I want, because I want to use this character for different contexts, is my first challenge is like, how do I add more detail and get this character to look more like me, or a version of me? So I look at there's this really interesting text called Anatomy for Sculptors, which was recommended to me by Nick Gall. Special thanks to him. He's a master character creator. And what Nick helped me understand is that if we just very quickly look at some of these markers of the human face that we know to be the defining unique characteristics, and if we go in and add those on top of any existing mesh, we get a lot of we can leverage that detail on top of what already exists. So in particular, we see here the shape of the lips, where the lips meet the nose, and this kind of divot that sits underneath. Then also the eyes, the way the ocular region has these folds where it comes and meets the cheek. So these are the couple of areas that I want to zone in on and see if I could add some more detail to this mesh. And in ZBrush, using some direct modeling techniques, I just kind of add this in. And you know, I'm not a sculptor, but I did find this process pretty intuitive once I knew what markers I was looking for. So the other cool thing that happens is I can start to introduce some asymmetry into my face as well, because one of the problems with this mesh is it's really perfect. And I need some of those imperfections that make my human face look the way it does. So another layer of modeling then, just some very fine displacement with, again, with ZBrush maps and brushes that already exist. So again, I get that imperfection you see in the area on the forehead, on the cheekbone, kind of on the side of the temple, which adds that layer of detail into the skin. So now I have a mesh that looks a lot like me, but it doesn't have any texture attached to it. So I go to XYZ texture because I need a high resolution texture. And the problem with that original texture that gets imported in to Reallusion is it's limited to 2K texture. So I want to find a texture that has a similar skin tone to me, and then the problem is I need to map it to this mesh. So I take this 2D texture and I use ZWrap and I just map it to my mesh, and I can see that it really does start to look a lot more like me. So now I have another problem. I need hair, and I don't know how to make hair. I'm not a hair groomer. So Reallusion has a bunch of really pretty good grooms just to get started. I picked this one in the middle, which I like. That's like the speculative version of me if I was in the world of Mad Max Fury Road. But I arrive at something that's perhaps a little bit more conservative. And I settle on this bob. And now I have to put an outfit on. Prefab costumes are really quick to construct using the Reallusion marketplace and what's available. They auto-fit and simulate to the character, any character. But they tend to be predefined by genre, and they have this real fantasy quality. So like, if I was like a secretary in the future, or I don't know, motorcycle mom, like I think these might work. But what I really want to do is I want to create the feeling of that lived reality. I want to chase that idea of bricolage that the French New Wave was so good at figuring out. How can I take what I know to be true about myself and attach it to this character? So I go back to the drawing board and I figure out something that looks a little bit more like me. But how do we get here from there? I want to share with you very quickly a workflow that I learned from my colleagues, Hannah Goldblatt and Heli Saloma at Victoria University of Wellington. They run the fashion technology degree. And Heli has a talk later this afternoon, so if you really want to know how this process works on a deeper level, please go to her talk. But what Hannah and Heli taught me is that I can take a real costume that exists and apply a pattern-making methodology to it and then simulate it onto my character. And this helps me solve some of those problems of like storytelling, like what would this character do in the story world that she exists in? And so this is just some examples of how I might take a 2D pattern that I made and then auto-simulate it to fit a character. So I did this workshop with them and I learned some of these ways of working. And then I started to apply it to my own character. So I built these shorts and this shirt from scratch very quickly. And then the cool thing about Marvelous and Clo3D is they have these prefab elements. So they had a blazer, and I was able to mod it and turn it into a longer coat. And now we start to arrive at something that starts to feel a lot more like this character. And I can simulate this costume onto my character for a bespoke fit, add some materials, and yeah, she starts to feel like a person that I can relate to. I can then push this rigged, shaded, and dressed character into the Unreal Engine and start to play with some staging and lighting to arrive at this prototype. And this is a work in progress, but this has been super useful for playing around with look development and scale in the project because I'll be working in virtual reality and ideating with some performers to understand what characters like this might do in a theatrical environment. Now I have a character and some props that she can interact with, and she responds to light. So we have a character in a costume. Let's start to explore mood and tone through light. This is a still from one of my favorite films, Nicholas Winding Refn's 2011 Drive. And how does this style translate to real-time lighting? It's pretty straightforward. All I've done here is I've taken that concept of the really hard back edge light, which of course you'll recall from the Avatar still. That was a technique that I learned in cinema. We use over and over again, like how do we quickly separate a character from a background, add a hard edge light, and then a beauty light, which just kind of like adds some reflection to the eyes and some modeling to the face. But I want to keep playing around with these ideas. Here's a still from another favorite film of mine, Barry Lyndon, directed by Stanley Kubrick from 1975. And what's really beautiful about this film is if you've watched it or spent any time studying it, it's all lit by firelight and really fast lenses. Lucky for us, in real time, this all just works. We just create a flame, add a really small point light with shadowing, and we start to get this quality of soft, very warm, glowing light. But I want to keep going. Here's a still from Beauty and the Beast, directed by Jean Cocteau, 1946. And there's another layer of challenge here now. So now I have a character, I can put in an environment, I can get some really responsive lights and create a style sheet, style frame. But what happens when there's an environment and I need to very quickly create a story world with some geometry? I still have a basic problem. I'm not a modeler. So I turned to a practice that arose out of hobbyist model building culture called kit bashing, which you're probably really familiar with. And kit bashing is exactly what it sounds like. You create your own new thing by jamming a bunch of ready-made things together from generic kits like model trains. And model makers used this practice for a long time, but it became really popular with special effects, film production in movies like 2001: Space Odyssey in the late 1960s, and then in the 1970s with Star Wars. So I wanted to construct that scene from Beauty and the Beast by kind of drawing upon my own experience of when I was in Paris and I went to the Café Richelieu, Angelina, at the Louvre in France. And for those of you that have ever been there or are not familiar with it, this is a classic Louis XIV decor, and it has a very modern quality because of the, there's beautiful light in this room, and it just bounces around all over the place. So I remembered this handy medieval modular set piece from Quixel Megascans, which some of you might be familiar with. And I figured out that I could just very quickly do a paint over of the albedo map with Quixel Mixer and arrive at something that really does start to feel like both, the Café Richelieu and also that style frame that I'm chasing from Beauty and the Beast. So this is bricolage in action. Like the French New Wave, I use my own lived experience, what I have at hand, and conventions of genre to bricolage together a new story world. And I want to thank Sunny Tyke, who's an effects TD, for helping me sim these curtains. So the problem that this bricolage approach attempts to address is the gap in specialized knowledge in computer graphics production, specifically asset production. In large studios, teams work quickly because there are a lot of specialists. In independent art, we have to do more and take a very generalized approach. And what bricolage allows us to do is apply very old concepts to new ways of making art. It allows us to do more with less, and ideally spend all of our time amplifying, most of our time amplifying our own vision. And very quickly, I want to share with you how this approach is now being used at scale in my lighting and rendering class. So my students, some who are here today, build their own digital humans, create their own style frames, and very quickly get these like really cool self-portraits. And then they start to tell stories using this technique. And so here again, we have some of these characters, and they're put into the speculative world of films that already exist. So I see Ashish is here in the audience, and he put together this really beautiful interpretation of Blade Runner 2049, which you see on the left. Lucy Yeagers did an interpretation of Birdman, and it's a really cool technique for using autobiography, your own lived experience, your love of storytelling and films, and quickly craft a world using a bricolage approach. So just a quick shout out for anyone in the audience who's thinking of studying games. We've got some stuff going on at Victoria University. So I invite you now to think about how you can work like a bricoleur in your own practice, to improvise your own life experience for the purpose of storytelling, and to use devious methods to make beautiful things. Thank you so much for listening.
Sorry, this is not working. But, if you guys have any questions, you can pop into the Venti app now. And nothing's up yet, but I guess I'll ask first. So for you as an artist, how do you think that for the young people here, how does the technical barrier stop you from becoming storytellers? Because I feel like as a specialist, it's becoming increasingly, and with all the talks that we've been hearing, like the engines and the softwares that we have to grab, I think the learning curve is becoming really, really steep. So how do you think that, what is the best approach to start a career in, like this?
Yeah, I mean, I think the expectations are becoming steeper, but the learning curve is maybe leveling out a little because there's, people have talked about this, there's so much opportunity for learning software and doing the tutorials. And I guess our approach at Victoria with the MDT is this idea that if you can learn concepts, right? So that backlight, front light, Rembrandt light that we went through at the very beginning, like that's the magic sauce. If you understand how that works in relationship to character, even in a physical way, then you know what you need to do with the tools. And I think the technical barriers are easily overcome simply by like time and revision and putting in the hours. But if you don't understand the concepts, then it feels like you're in the weeds, you don't know what you're doing. So that's what I think the balance is like, do you conceptually understand what we're trying to do with light, like how we're shaping the visual world to tell a story? And if so, then whether you're using Unreal Engine, I mean, we always want you to use Unreal Engine, but you could also use, we also light in a pre-rendered context, so we're using Houdini, Solid Angle, Redshift, and that asset, the reason we make these digital humans is we can push them into any context.
Great, thank you. We've got a couple of questions coming in. So what is something that you know now that you wish you know earlier in your career?
Something that I know now. I think I wish I had taken my own advice that I just gave you, that I really spent time thinking of myself as a storyteller. I spent a lot of years working in the studio system, believing that this is a skill that can only be in the service of a larger process, of telling someone else's story. And it took me many years of working through that to realize that, oh, I have a special power, and it's lighting, and that is a way of telling stories. And now that's the way in which I look at the world, and that's how I write stories as well.
Great, thank you. So from Poppy, are there any games that comes to mind that you think showcase excellent lightings?
Yeah, I mean, I love the stuff that Playdead does. It's more stylized, but it's this very Nordic, surreal world that I immediately want to, drop into, because I think that their design is really beautiful. Control is a really beautifully lit game, and Helly will talk about that later today, I believe. And actually, Grand Auto, what is it? Grand Theft Auto, yeah. The Los Angeles edition. My partner plays video games, and I second screen them. So I like watching them for lighting. He plays them, and these are the games that he plays that I'm like, oh yeah, lighting, really amazing. Red Dead Redemption, for sure.
Okay. And how was the recent Unreal Engine technology coming and changed how you do your work?
Yeah, so what I love about working with the real-time render is it's this idea that all the years that I spent working in visual effects in studios, this was what we were chasing, is that you sit down, you have a character, you're lighting, it's responsive, you're not waiting, you're not going and making a cup of coffee while you get a frame, right? So that responsiveness, which is why we work with these lights when my students first come into my class, that's what we want, is we want to set up an environment where the light is very responsive so we can quickly design, redesign, and revise. So that's why I love the real-time engine, and now a lot of the offline rendering technologies are catching up.
Great, thank you. Do you have any questions from the audience now, or I can go? So I guess I'll just ask a personal question. So for you, as a lighting artist, how do you incorporate working with the digitals and computer lightings and with real lighting? So in your teachings and in your makings, I guess, do you, use this Bricolage kind of method to combine the two, to test out, to experiment?
Yeah, I think that just getting on the stage and lighting yourself is the best way to understand what's happening. And then it also does this cool thing where you can learn what it feels like to be embodied, in an embodied artistic experience of lighting. And there's something about physically moving the light around, understanding the position that your body needs to be in relationship to the light. So the thing about the Rembrandt, the reason it works is because it's not all this flat stuff happening on one plane. The light is angled at you. You yourself are kind of in this three-quarter view, and so then it washes over you in this way that's very flattering. And when you do that on the physical stage with a real light, then you understand when you're using the digital tools what you're trying to achieve.
Great, thank you. I think we're perfectly on time now, so thank you, Raqi.
Thank you so much.
No, that's right. Thank you so much, guys. Great.
Thank you for coming.